Mother, you are nothing but an old woman now. Stop clutching those paintings like a miser. Hand them to us while you are still alive, or do you plan to rot with them in your coffin and leave the world laughing at your greed? It was at the memorial service for my husband, Charles Langford, and the one who hurled those words was my daughter Vivian, standing beside her husband Edward, my son-in-law. The words ripped through the silence like glass shattering, cruel and deliberate. My chest felt pierced, not by grief alone, but by the open contempt of my own daughter. Heads turned, whispers stirred in the pews. I tasted iron at the back of my throat, yet forced myself to remain upright, fingers gripping my gloves until the stitching bit into my skin. The smell of lilies pressed down heavy, choking, and I thought of Charles, whose body lay in eternal rest, unaware that his only child was tearing apart his legacy. Edward stood beside her, face polite but empty, and then his eyes slid toward the back. I followed the glance. Victor Moretti. Even in shadow he radiated menace, the arrogance of a man too familiar with sin to respect the solemnity of death. Their gaze locked, Edward and Victor, a silent pact flickering like a match in the dark. I realized then this humiliation was no slip of anger, but a calculated blow, rehearsed to make me bow. My heart trembled, but within it came a cold clarity. Charles had warned me of the wolves that circle wealth, and now I could see the snarl on their faces. I steadied myself, swallowed my pain, and let silence wrap around me like armor, for silence sometimes cuts deeper than any reply. Only minutes earlier, Harper Quinn, my husband's longtime attorney and the executor of his estate, had stood before the mourners and read the will with a steady, resolute voice. He had declared that the entire $800 million collection now belonged to me, Dorothy Langford. A hush fell over the room before breaking into ripples of shocked whispers. I turned just enough to see Edward and Vivian, their faces drained, mouths slightly open, as though the ground had shifted beneath them. For a breath they stayed frozen, then Edward bent close, whispering urgently into my daughter's ear. I could not hear the words, but the tilt of her chin and the glint in his eyes betrayed the truth. They were already plotting, right there at their father's memorial. The sacred service turned into a battlefield for greed. My stomach knotted, but I forced my face to remain calm, the same composure I had mastered during decades beside Charles. Harper leaned closer to me, his voice dropping so only I could hear. He reminded me gently that several paintings carried RFID tags and sealed insurance records, that any unauthorized movement would trigger alerts to the insurers and the authorities. His tone was measured, but the warning beneath was sharp. Danger was near, and he was arming me with quiet knowledge. I nodded slightly, appearing as though I was acknowledging condolences, but inside a cold current of resolve stirred. If they dared touch Charles's legacy, every step would betray them, every act would be exposed. Before the flowers had even wilted on Charles's memorial, my daughter struck again, her voice sharp enough to cut through the solemn air like a blade. In front of cousins, uncles, and old family friends who had gathered to honor his memory, Vivian smirked and asked why I clung to those paintings when I had never understood art in my life. Her words were not just careless or thoughtless, they were a deliberate and public stripping of dignity, timed to shame me when grief had already left me raw and unguarded. I saw a few relatives lower their eyes, unwilling to meet mine, while others whispered behind gloved hands, embarrassed for me yet still too hesitant, too afraid of the spectacle to defend me. My cheeks burned hot, but I kept still, my silence serving as a fragile shield I could not afford to drop. Edward stood faithfully at her side, lips pressed into a thin smile, his eyes glinting with satisfaction, pleased by the sting of her insult. I knew then that the wound she dealt was not private, not something that could be mended in the quiet of our home. It had been etched into the memory of every person present, carved into the very air of that service. What I did not know was how cruelly it would echo later, when the scandal broke wide open and the press unearthed her remark. It would headline the betrayal, the story of a daughter who mocked her mother's worth while plotting to steal her father's legacy. A few days after the funeral, they invited me to what they called a family dinner, promising a chance to sit together, to heal after loss. I arrived at the house Charles and I had once built with love and sacrifice, only to find it transformed into a stage set for their performance. Red wine gleamed in crystal glasses, silver cutlery sparkled under the glow of candlelight, and the table was dressed as if for celebration, not mourning. Vivian clutched my hand too tightly, her smile far too polished, her words dripping with honey. Mother, you only need to rest now. Let us handle the paperwork, the insurance, the burdens. You have carried enough. Beside her, Edward moved with the ease of a practiced host, every gesture rehearsed, refilling my glass each time it dipped below the rim. I nodded politely, let the rim brush my lips, and then, when their eyes shifted away, I tipped the wine into the folds of my napkin or slipped it quietly beneath the table. Their performance was seamless, but it was theater nonetheless, and I had seen too many plays in my life not to recognize actors at work. Every gesture, every phrase of comfort carried the same undercurrent, a steady drumbeat toward one goal. Hand it all over, Mother, surrender the legacy, make it ours. My heart ached, but not from grief alone. It was the sharp, relentless ache of betrayal, sharpened further by the realization that they mistook me for a fool, a prop in their scheme. I sat quietly, tasting not wine but the bitterness of pretense, and I vowed, deep within, that they would never see me broken. Edward reached into his leather briefcase and drew out a neat stack of papers, sliding them across the polished table with a practiced flourish that betrayed just how long he had rehearsed this charade. He spoke smoothly, his voice wrapped in reassurance, every syllable carefully measured. This is nothing more than supplemental insurance for the collection. If there were ever a fire or a theft, you would be compensated. You lose nothing by signing. His words were honeyed, dripping with false concern, but my instincts pricked like needles. Something about his eagerness, the way he leaned forward as if to close a trap, made my stomach twist. I took the top page in my hand and scanned it quickly. To an untrained eye, it looked like routine paperwork, filled with endless clauses and fine print. But the structure was too heavy, too deliberate, each line weighted to conceal rather than reveal. I saw the hidden snare, a clause buried deep that would grant Vivian and Edward full authority to manage the collection, to move or even sell it without my consent. Vivian leaned closer, her eyes wide with feigned worry, her voice carrying the practiced tone of a dutiful daughter. Mother, just sign it. It will make everything safer. We only want to protect you. The room grew stifling with their pretense, the air heavy as candle wax. I kept my face calm, my lips softening into the faintest smile, though inside I felt my heart pound steady and strong, a drumbeat of defiance. They believed I was cornered, but I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. I laid the papers back on the table with slow care, resting my hand lightly on them as if in thought. In truth, my mind was sharpening like a blade, and the decision had already been made. I would not sign away Charles's legacy, not today, not ever. Instead, I laid the folder gently on the table, the weight of its contents heavier than stone. Inside were the copies of Charles's will, the original insurance contracts, the certified appraisals, every safeguard he had so carefully arranged in anticipation of a day like this. My voice was calm, steady, almost soft, yet edged with steel. Everything has already been prepared by Charles. Nothing further is needed. For a heartbeat there was silence, the kind that thickens a room, and then Edward's mask cracked. With sudden fury, he swiped the folder from the table, papers scattering across the floor like wounded birds struggling to fly. Before I could move, his polished shoe came down hard, grinding the pages into the rug as if to erase them from existence. Gasps fluttered around the room, but none dared intervene, no cousin or family friend brave enough to stop him. I felt heat rise in my chest, my pulse quickening, but I kept my hands folded, refusing to stoop for scraps of my own dignity. Vivian's laughter cut the air, sharp and cruel, echoing off the high ceiling like broken glass. She pointed her finger straight at me, her smile twisted into something almost feral. "You are nothing but a greedy old woman. Do you think a handful of papers makes you a queen? People see only a foolish hag clinging to wealth she cannot use. We are the future of this family, not you." Her words struck deeper than Edward's heel, stripping away respect in front of our kin, leaving me exposed in my own home. I drew a long breath, lifting my chin until my neck ached. Pain burned, searing and humiliating, but beneath it a new resolve stirred, cold and unyielding. They had crossed a line they could never retreat from, and though they could not see it yet, the cost of their cruelty would soon be their undoing. I bent slowly, gathering each page from the floor, brushing away the dust with steady hands. To those watching, I must have looked defeated, the image of an old widow bowed beneath the cruelty of her own kin. Let them believe it. I had learned long ago that silence can be armor, and patience a blade sharper than any word. I stacked the papers carefully, slid them back into the folder, and kept my face as still as marble. Beneath the table, hidden by the linen cloth, my fingers moved across the screen of my phone. One word, simple and precise: ultramarine. It was the code Charles and Harper had agreed upon years ago, a shield prepared for the day wolves might bare their teeth. Harper would know what it meant. If he did not hear from me within 6 hours, he would set in motion the missing safe protocol. Letters would be dispatched to the museum, the insurance board, and the FBI, alerting them to possible abuse and illicit trade. My pulse quickened, but I forced my breath to remain calm, my eyes fixed on the flicker of candlelight. Vivian and Edward thought they had stripped me of dignity, thought they held power. They did not see the quiet resolve that hardened in me, nor the net already tightening around them. Edward's rage finally broke its mask. With a false smile, he ushered the last of the dinner guests out, whispering polite thanks at the door, but his eyes burned with fury. The moment the house fell silent, his hand clamped hard on my arm. Vivian followed, her nails digging into my sleeve as they dragged me down the narrow steps to the basement. My protests met only with a cruel shove. The smell of damp stone rose up, cold and suffocating. Edward snatched the phone from my grasp and hurled it aside, the screen cracking against the wall. With a loud clang, he slammed the iron door shut, locking me in as though I were a criminal. They stood above me, their figures looming in the dim light, voices spitting venom. "You selfish old hag. You think you can keep everything. You will sign, or you will rot here." Vivian's face was twisted with contempt, her words cutting deeper than her husband's shouts. My heart quaked, and for a moment despair threatened to consume me. This was my daughter, the child I had carried, now treating me as nothing but an obstacle to be crushed. The chill of betrayal pressed harder than the damp air, and tears welled unbidden. For the first time that night, I felt the weight of hopelessness, as if the walls themselves were closing in to bury me alive. Vivian stood on the stair above me, the dim light carving shadows across her face. In her hand was a worn photograph, the wedding portrait of Charles and me, once framed with pride in our home. Without hesitation, she let it slip from her fingers, and it fell hard onto the cold cement floor, landing in the dust at my feet. The sound echoed sharper than glass breaking. Her voice followed, sharp and merciless. "If you sign the papers now, Edward will let you out. If not, you will die down here with your pile of rotten paintings." My chest tightened. This was not only imprisonment, this was the desecration of memory, of the sacred vows that had built the very family she now betrayed. I bent slowly, lifting the photo with trembling hands, brushing away the dirt as gently as if touching Charles's face again. Tears blurred my sight, but behind them a spark burned steady. Vivian had always craved admiration, hated the discipline her father and I imposed. She wanted luxury, applause, the soft cushions of indulgence. Edward had fed her those illusions, wrapping her in sweet lies while draining her spirit like a parasite. He was drowning in debt, a gambler smooth with words, and he had twisted my only child into a weapon against me. But as I held the photo, I saw clearly. They had already gone too far, so blinded by greed they could no longer turn back. That was their weakness, and one day soon it would destroy them. Edward's phone buzzed in the silence of the locked house, the sound unnerving in its suddenness. His shoulders stiffened, and his voice dropped low as he stepped aside to answer. It was Victor Moretti, smooth and commanding even through the static of the line, a man who needed no raised tone to assert power. "Tonight, I have a buyer. Bring me one of the Grade A pieces from the collection, cash in hand, and your debts will vanish." The promise was poison wrapped in sugar, and Edward swallowed it whole without hesitation. His face lit with desperate relief, as if salvation had been delivered, when in truth it was damnation wearing a velvet glove. He hurried toward the storage room, his steps uneven, sweat already glistening on his brow as though he were about to claim a prize at last. With trembling hands, eager and reckless, he unlatched the frame of one of Charles's most prized works. The instant the panel shifted from its mount, a faint electronic chirp pulsed through the silence, unnoticed by him but damning all the same. Invisible to Edward, the RFID system embedded in the frame had come alive, sending its chain of alerts outward like ripples, first to the insurance company, then to the museum that once displayed the masterpiece, and finally to the FBI's art crime unit. Every movement, every second of Edward's fumbling tampering was logged, a perfect trail of evidence that would haunt him long after the night was over. Below, in the basement's suffocating dark, I heard the groan of wood and the metallic scrape of hinges above me. My breath caught in my chest. Charles had been right all along. Greed always bares its teeth when it believes the kill is certain, and in their arrogance they had revealed themselves fully, without disguise. The living room was dim, lit only by the dull glow of a single lamp and the red shimmer of wine trembling in Edward's glass. His hand shook as he poured, but his eyes brightened the moment the door opened. Victor Moretti entered with the calm swagger of a man accustomed to control, his long black coat brushing the floor like a cloak of authority. Beside him stood a younger man in a plain gray suit, who introduced himself with effortless charm as Mr. Gray, a private buyer and international art broker. Edward leapt to his feet, almost spilling the wine in his eagerness, and with clumsy pride yanked the cloth from the stolen painting like a magician desperate for applause. His voice cracked with excitement as he gestured wildly at the canvas. Vivian hovered near, her chin lifted high in a pose of elegance, though her eyes betrayed her greed, shining too brightly, too hungrily. Moretti's lips curved into a slow grin, his tone smooth yet edged with menace. "Good, Edward. Tonight your luck changes. Once the papers are signed, all your debts are gone." His words spread through the room like smoke, heavy, intoxicating, and suffocating. Vivian's gaze flickered toward the basement door where her mother lay captive, then back to her husband. In that moment, she believed with absolute certainty that their lives were about to turn golden, that she would finally step into the glittering world of wealth and admiration she had always craved. She thought victory was already hers, blind to the truth that every step, every move, every careless mistake was being watched, documented, and sealed as evidence against them. The night was heavy with silence, so thick it seemed even the crickets dared not sing, until the iron gate bell rang, sharp and insistent, echoing through the empty marble halls. Headlights swept across the long driveway as a convoy of dark vehicles rolled to a stop before the Langford estate, engines humming low, their presence unmistakably official. Doors opened one after another, each arrival building the weight of inevitability. First stepped Dr. Avery Cole, director of the National Museum, carrying the authority of an institution that had once safeguarded Charles's masterpieces during exhibitions, his posture grave, his eyes set with purpose. Behind him came Harper Quinn, my husband's loyal attorney, holding not just the original will but every legal document that bound the collection to me, his jaw tight with the righteousness of justice long prepared. From another car emerged two agents, Brooks and Linn of the FBI art crime team, summoned by the silent alerts triggered the very moment Edward had dared tamper with the painting's frame. Finally, Mr. Patel from the bank strode forward, a leather folder in his hand containing the foreclosure notice and the detailed records of Edward's ruinous gambling debts. Their arrival was not chance, not fate, but the inevitable outcome of safeguards carefully placed years earlier. The RFID system had sounded its alarm the instant the canvas was shifted, its chain of warnings spreading across institutions like fire through dry grass. And Harper, faithful to the promise he had once made to Charles, had already activated the missing safe protocol when my coded signal reached him. Now, beneath the cold, merciless moonlight, it felt as though justice itself had gathered at my doorstep. The knock of authority resounded through the hall as the FBI agents demanded to see me. Edward stammered, his voice catching, while Vivian's painted smile faltered, her mask slipping as panic gnawed at her edges. They tried to deflect, murmuring excuses that I was resting, that I was too fragile for late-night disturbances. But Harper stepped forward, his tone firm and unyielding, slicing through their lies. According to the will and the law, only Dorothy Langford may meet with this delegation. His words severed the final thread of their deception. Cornered, Edward cursed under his breath, fumbling with the heavy keys as sweat rolled down his temple. The iron door to the basement groaned open with a long, dreadful screech. I stepped out slowly, my dress smeared with dust, my hair tangled, yet my gaze steady, my spine unbroken. Gasps stirred among the officials at the sight. Without delay, Agent Brooks retrieved the feed from the estate's security system. On the glowing screen, images flickered. Edward and Vivian dragging me down the stairs, the clang of the door, the lock twisted tight. The evidence was irrefutable. Elder abuse, false imprisonment. Every cruel word they had spat upstairs now hung heavy in the air, damning them beyond excuse. I stood in the center of the storm, battered in appearance but resolute in spirit. They thought to bury me in darkness, but it was their cruelty that had brought the light crashing down upon them. Half an hour earlier, the illicit art deal had already begun to unfold under the dim, watchful lights of the Langford estate. Mr. Gray leaned closer to the canvas, his expression smooth with the practiced interest of a wealthy buyer, every movement carefully staged. Edward, sweating with eagerness, snapped photos on his phone and hurried to forward them, his fingers clumsy with greed and haste. Moretti dictated the price, his voice low but commanding, the kind of tone that left no room for refusal, and Mr. Gray nodded as though in firm agreement. "Very good, gentlemen. Send me the draft contract and I will confirm with my client tonight." Edward rushed to comply, pulling up a template and scribbling details with desperate energy, his eyes gleaming with the fantasy of debts erased, of freedom bought with betrayal. What he did not know was that every message, every photo, every attachment he sent was already mirrored on FBI servers. Mr. Gray was no broker at all, but a covert operative, patient and precise, carefully baiting the hook until the fish swallowed whole. The supposed transaction was never about art. It was the trap that revealed the partnership between Edward Hale and Victor Moretti, a scheme woven from greed, illicit trade, and stolen legacy. Back in the present, the room felt as if the very air had been sliced apart, the silence sharp enough to wound. Agent Brooks stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble, his badge gleaming under the chandelier like a seal of judgment. With a deliberate motion he drew the handcuffs from his belt, their metallic glint catching every eye. His voice rang out with the authority of law itself, like a verdict that could not be appealed, only endured. "Victor Moretti, you are under arrest for trafficking in stolen art and laundering money through your casino. We have secured testimony, financial records, and tonight's attempted transaction as evidence. Edward Hale, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud, unlawful imprisonment of an elder, and collusion in an international smuggling operation." Each charge struck like a hammer blow, driving cracks into the facade they had worn for so long. Before Edward could shape his slippery excuses, his arms were wrenched behind his back. The metallic snap of cuffs bit into his wrists, and Moretti's hands followed, once accustomed to fine cigars and diamond rings, now bound in cold steel. Vivian stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, as her husband and his powerful patron, men she had believed untouchable, were reduced to criminals before her eyes. At that precise moment, Mr. Patel from the bank unfolded a thick folder, his tone professional but merciless, each word striking with surgical precision. In addition to these criminal charges, our records show the Hale family has $27 million in unpaid debts. Effective immediately, all properties, vehicles, and accounts under Vivian and Edward's names are frozen and will be scheduled for auction. The declaration landed heavier than the arrests themselves. Vivian staggered, her knees buckling as if the ground beneath her had betrayed her. She saw, in one terrible instant, the unraveling of everything she had built her vanity upon: the mansion with its chandeliers, the sports cars gleaming in the drive, the jewels and gowns displayed like trophies of a life she believed untouchable. Now they were gone, reduced to numbers on a bank ledger, soon to be catalogued, tagged, and sold to strangers. Her face drained of color. Tears welled but did not fall. She was too stunned, too shattered, even for grief. Edward, cuffed and cursing, tried to spit venom back at the agents, but his words rang hollow, stripped of the charm that had once deceived her. Moretti's silence was worse, the silence of a predator cornered, lips pressed into a hard line as he realized his empire had crumbled in a single night, all its shadows dragged into light. And there I stood, Dorothy Langford, the mother they had mocked, the widow they had locked in darkness. My clothes were still marked by dust, my body weary, yet my spine remained unbent, my eyes unbroken. Around me, the museum director, the FBI, and Harper Quinn acknowledged me with respect that felt both quiet and absolute. I was recognized at last as the rightful guardian of Charles's legacy. In that moment, the weight of humiliation slid from my shoulders, replaced by a calm, unshakable dignity, one they could never again touch, never again steal. In the grand hall, the air was so still it seemed even the chandeliers held their breath, their crystals catching faint light but refusing to tremble. I stood tall despite the dust clinging stubbornly to my dress, despite the exhaustion that pulled at my bones, and let my voice ring out across the marble walls like a bell of judgment. You are the shame of this family. You live off others, spend recklessly, and run from every duty. And now you dare to lock away your own mother for money. This collection stays with me, because at least it still has worth. Do not expect me to hand over a single cent, for you have already lost the smallest measure of respect a child owes a parent. The words rolled heavy through the chamber, my tone as cold as iron, cutting the last fragile thread that bound us together. Silence followed, deep and absolute, pressing down on everyone present. Vivian crumbled into a chair, her sobs breaking through the hush, no longer the polished daughter of society, but a shattered woman stripped bare of her illusions. Edward kept his head bowed, the steel cuffs on his wrists gleaming under the lights, his bravado dissolved, replaced by a hollow shame that left him looking smaller than I had ever seen him. Around us, the officials bore witness. The FBI agents exchanged a look of grim satisfaction. Harper Quinn closed his folder with the calm of justice fulfilled, and Dr. Cole from the museum inclined his head with quiet respect. Mr. Patel from the bank made one final notation in his ledger, his expression fixed and unyielding, a reminder that debts still demanded their due. And I, though weary to my core, felt no triumph, only clarity. The ties of blood had been severed, the last betrayal spoken aloud, the final reckoning complete. What remained was not victory, but survival, and the knowledge that I had protected the legacy Charles entrusted to my care. My son-in-law, Edward Hale, later stood in court, his once polished suits replaced by a plain prison uniform, his charm stripped away under the crushing weight of evidence. The charges were read one by one: unlawful imprisonment, fraud, conspiracy, and art smuggling. Each word fell like a blow, striking him lower, until the man who had once boasted of clever deals and effortless persuasion could no longer lift his eyes. The sentence was years behind bars, and when the gavel fell with its final crack, his name was ruined beyond repair. Inside prison walls, he was no longer the smooth-talking husband who manipulated with ease, but a hollow figure, mocked for his arrogance, left to wither into bitterness and obscurity. Victor Moretti's fall was louder, more spectacular in its collapse. The FBI unveiled his vast web of laundering through casinos, exposing decades of shadowy dealings that had once seemed untouchable. His assets were seized in a sweep, his secret accounts frozen tight, and the network of clients who once bowed to him scattered overnight, fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. The man who had strutted as a king of the underworld was reduced to nothing more than a number stitched onto prison fabric. His cigar lounges and velvet-draped back rooms were replaced with steel bars, harsh cots, and fluorescent light that showed no mercy. No one whispered his name in awe anymore. What remained was only the echo of greed undone, a cautionary silence, a reminder that empires built on vice collapse as swiftly and as violently as they rise. Vivian's fall came quietly at first, like silk unraveling thread by thread, almost too subtle for her to notice until the fabric of her life lay in tatters. The handbags, the glittering jewelry, the sleek cars, each piece of her curated image disappeared one by one, sold off in desperate auctions to chip away at the mountain of Edward's debts. Yet the hole was too deep, and no matter how much she surrendered, the numbers never balanced. The bank soon came knocking, cold and efficient, with letters that carried no pity. They reclaimed the mansion she had once flaunted as her kingdom, stripping her of the last symbol of status she had clung to. Forced to pack her belongings into plain cardboard boxes, Vivian moved into a cramped apartment, a place whose peeling paint and thin walls mocked the marble halls she had once called home. For the first time in her life, she faced the grind of full-time work, her manicured hands fumbling over tasks she had never been forced to learn. Office clerks and supervisors treated her not as a hostess or queen, but as another tired employee, and the sting of anonymity cut deep. The friends who had once crowded her parties, sipping champagne and praising her gowns, began to vanish one by one, each excuse thinner than the last, unwilling to be associated with disgrace. In the newspapers, her name surfaced not for elegance, but for scandal. The daughter who had locked her own mother in a basement for money. Each headline was another lash, branding her reputation beyond repair, replayed in whispers at cafes and sideways glances in grocery aisles. Vivian tried to hold her head high, to walk as though unshaken, but the mirror told a different story. Lines of exhaustion etched into her skin, eyes dulled by shame and sleepless nights. The wealth was gone, but worse than that, the mask she had worn for years had been torn away. What remained was not simply loss, but the lifelong burden of dishonor, a shadow she could never escape. After the storm had passed, I chose not to cling to the ruins of bitterness but to build something new, something that felt alive. The collection Charles had guarded so carefully no longer sat hidden in vaults, gathering dust behind locked doors. Instead, I signed an agreement with the National Museum, granting them the right to exhibit the paintings long term. It was not merely preservation, it was a gift to the public, a chance for Charles's devotion to art to breathe beyond our private walls. Standing in the gallery, I sometimes lingered in the corner and heard whispers of awe from strangers who never knew his name, who never shook his hand. Yet in those quiet moments, Charles was alive again, shimmering through brushstroke and color, his spirit stitched into every canvas. With part of the fortune he left me, I founded the Charles Langford Scholarship, dedicated to older women artists, women who had been overlooked, dismissed, or told it was too late for them to dream. Their trembling hands still carried fire, their canvases still had voices, and I wanted to make sure those voices could finally be heard. Letters of gratitude began to arrive, written in shaky ink but brimming with life. They told stories of women painting again after decades, of classrooms where they now taught, of finding breath without apology. I saved each letter in a box, proof that hope, once nourished, can bloom even late in the season. I moved to a quiet house by the sea, far from the noise of scandal and betrayal. Each morning I walked the shoreline, the waves smoothing away the last traces of confinement and cruelty, the salt air filling me with a new kind of freedom. I painted again, not for fame or money, but for peace, letting colors spill across canvas as a form of prayer. I wrote my memories into pages, careful lines that might one day guide others who had stood in the shadows of betrayal, reminding them that survival is its own kind of victory. No longer haunted by wealth or family strife, I found joy in simplicity, the rustle of curtains in a sea breeze, the creak of wooden floors, the respect that came not from titles or possessions, but from the dignity I reclaimed for myself. And one evening, I stood before Charles's largest painting, now hanging beneath a golden beam in the museum. My reflection glimmered faintly on the glass as I whispered, "Justice may come late, but it never fails to arrive. And happiness is not triumph, but the quiet peace we keep within ourselves." If this story touched you, remember, silence is not weakness. It can be the sharpest weapon of all. Share this tale with someone who has ever been belittled, so they know that dignity can always be defended at any age.